In the winter of 1887, a silver mining settlement in the Laurentian highlands of Quebec employed 211 men. By the last week of February, not a single one of them remained. I was the only man to walk out of that valley, and I walked out alone. My name is Edouard Bouchard. I worked as a shaft foreman for the Dominion Silver Company for 14 years before the winter of 1887, and for every one of those years I was considered a practical man. I did not believe in old stories. I had grown up near Trois-Rivières in a household that valued hard work and concrete thinking, and by the time I was hired on at the Dominion Company's northern operation, I had seen enough of the wilderness to know exactly what dangers it held. It held cold. It held distance. It held animals that could kill you and terrain that could break you. But it held nothing that could not be explained in physical terms if you looked carefully enough. I believed that until the winter of 1887. I have not believed it since. I am telling this account in 1921, more than 30 years after the events I am describing. I've been asked to speak about what happened at the Lacasse Creek settlement on 3 separate occasions by men compiling records for the territorial government. And on each of those occasions I gave a shortened and carefully sanitized version of events because I was not prepared to be called a madman by officials whose pensions depended on rational explanations for things. I am 81 years old now. I have no pension to protect. I have nothing to protect at all except the accuracy of the record. And I have decided that before I die, the accurate record should exist somewhere in writing. What happened at Lacasse Creek was not an avalanche. It was not a gas pocket. It was not a fever, a flood, or a failure of supply lines that drove 211 men to abandon an operation. What happened at Lacasse Creek was the thing the Algonquin people of that region had been warning about for 3 generations. The thing they refused to speak of by name in certain months of the year, the thing they described as an emptiness that walked on 2 legs and grew larger each time it fed. They called it the Wendigo, and it cleared that settlement the way a man clears a table. I will tell you exactly what happened. I will tell it in the order it happened. I will not embellish. I will not soften. And I will tell you the one moment I saw it clearly enough to describe its full shape, because that moment has lived behind my eyes every single night for 33 years, and it deserves to be placed somewhere outside my own memory before I take it into the ground with me. The Dominion Silver Company began its northern Quebec operation in the late summer of 1886. I was transferred from a copper operation near Rouen to take the shaft foreman position at a site they called Lacasse Creek, named for the small stream that ran through the valley floor. The valley itself was situated roughly 40 miles northeast of the closest established settlement, a logging town called Sainte-Marguerite that had perhaps 300 permanent residents and a general store that doubled as a post office. The valley was beautiful in August. I remember that clearly. The spruce and fir came down the slopes on both sides in dense, unbroken lines, and the creek ran cold and clear over a gray stone bed, and the air at that altitude smelled of pine resin and cold water in a way that no air I've breathed since has ever quite replicated. There were perhaps 60 men on site when I arrived, mostly experienced miners brought up from operations in Ontario and New Brunswick, with a small contingent of local Quebec men who knew the terrain and spoke both French and English. We began shaft work in September, and by November, the operation had expanded to include 2 primary shafts, a secondary exploratory bore, a bunkhouse complex that could accommodate 120 men, a cookhouse, a company store, a medical cabin, and a stable that housed 14 horses used for hauling equipment and ore. By January of 1887, the workforce had grown to 211 men. The company had found a silver vein in the eastern shaft of unexpected quality and had moved resources aggressively to expand operations. Men were being transferred in from other sites on a weekly basis. The camp felt prosperous. The company's superintendent, a man named Hargreaves, who came up from Montreal twice a year to inspect operations, was openly pleased with progress reports and had promised bonuses for the senior staff if production targets were met by spring. I focused on shaft depth, timber supports, ventilation, and ore quality. I did not pay particular attention to the fact that the Algonquin guides we had hired to help with initial surveying had, to a man, she declined contract renewals in October and refused to explain precisely why. I should have paid attention to that. There were 4 Algonquin men who had worked with the survey team during the site selection phase. The company referred to them in its records simply as Guides 1 through 4. The lead guide was a man in his late 50s or early 60s who had a detailed knowledge of the Laurentian watershed that no map could replicate. He could read snowfall patterns, identify animal behavior changes before any European observer would notice them, and navigate by landmarks in conditions of near-zero visibility. When his contract came up for renewal in early October, he declined without specific explanation. When pressed through an interpreter, he said only that the survey work was finished and he was needed elsewhere, and 2 of the other guides gave similar answers. The 4th guide, a younger man who had developed something of a rapport with one of the Quebec miners on site, said something more specific before he left. The miner, a man named Tremblay, who worked the secondary bore and who I knew well, told me what the guide had said on the morning the Algonquin men collected their final wages and departed. He said that the valley floor was territory that had not been disturbed in a very long time. He said there were reasons it had not been disturbed. He said that the company was making noise, deep noise, the kind of noise that travels far underground and does not stop traveling simply because it reaches the surface. He said that in the language of his people there was a word for what lived in terrain like this in deep winter, and that the appropriate response to learning that word applied to a place you were working was to leave that place. He said he had tried to convey this to the company through proper channels and had been thanked politely and ignored. And then he said, through Tremblay as interpreter, that he was sorry for what he believed was going to happen to us. Tremblay told me this story in the 2nd week of November. I told him not to repeat it to the other men because I did not want to disturb morale during a critical production period. I told myself the old guide was speaking from superstition and that his concern, however sincere, reflected a pre-scientific understanding of natural phenomena. I went back to my shift reports and my timber calculations. I think about that conversation every single day. The wolves left in the 1st week of November. This was noted in the company records as an environmental observation of no particular significance. The territorial naturalist who reviewed those records 2 years later, during the official inquiry into what happened at Lacasse Creek, made a point of highlighting this entry and noting that wolves do not abandon territory without significant cause. Prior to the 1st week of November, wolves had been a consistent background presence in the valley. You heard them at night. Occasionally you saw them at the tree line at dusk, watching the camp with the calm evaluative attention that wolves apply to anything moving through their territory. We kept the horses stabled and the meat stores properly secured, and beyond that, the wolves were simply part of the ambient life of the valley. And then, between the evening of November 6th and the morning of November 7th, they were gone. Not reduced in number, not pushed back from the immediate vicinity of the camp. Gone from the valley entirely. The last time anyone heard or saw wolves in proximity to the Lacasse Creek settlement was the night of November 6th. The naturalist who reviewed the records estimated, based on typical pack behavior and the density of the surrounding territory, that at least 3 separate wolf packs had been operating in the valley prior to that date. All 3 vacated the same area within the same 24-hour window. Something came into that valley in the 1st week of November that the wolves recognized and were unwilling to share territory with. The horses knew as well. Our stable hand, and a young man named Gervais, who had come up from a farm operation near Sherbrooke, reported to me on November 9th that the horses had been refusing feed for 2 nights and displaying what he called uncharacteristic anxiety. Horses in working conditions at that time were not pampered animals. They were accustomed to cold, to loud machinery, to close quarters with large numbers of men. The 14 horses in our stable had been working that operation since August without behavioral incident. Gervais described their behavior with the apologetic uncertainty of a young man who does not want to be perceived as an alarmist. The horses were pressing against the rear walls of their stall. They were not eating. Several of them had been sweating through the night despite the cold. One mare had developed a tremor in her hindquarters that had not resolved by morning. I told Gervais to monitor the situation and report back if it continued. The horses resumed eating on the 4th day, but they never fully settled again. For the remainder of the operation, they were anxious animals. They needed more handling. They spooked at sounds that would not have moved them in August. Gervais told me much later that they seemed to him like animals that had been permanently frightened by something they had seen and never quite stopped seeing. The first disappearances occurred in the 3rd week of November. 2 men who worked the northern shaft, a driller named Poirier and his partner, McIver, a man brought up from a New Brunswick operation, failed to report for their shift on the morning of November 19th. This was not immediately alarming. Men missed shifts for reasons ranging from illness to excessive consumption of the whiskey that circulated through any mining camp, regardless of company prohibitions. The shift supervisor noted their absence, assigned replacements for the day, and expected to address the matter when the men reappeared looking ashamed of themselves. They did not reappear. By the afternoon of November 20th, when both men had been missing for over 30 hours, I authorized a search of the camp and the immediate surrounding area. Their bunks had not been slept in on the night of the 18th. Their personal effects were present and undisturbed. Poirier had approximately 3 weeks of wages owed to him by the company's store account. McIver had a pocket watch and a photograph he kept on a shelf above his bunk. Neither man had given any indication of planning to leave the operation. The search party found nothing within the camp perimeter. When we extended the search to the area around the northern shaft, we found something that I initially chose to interpret in practical terms. There were marks in the frozen ground around the shaft entrance. The ground at that time was hard and covered in a thin layer of ice from a freezing rain the previous week, and on surfaces like that, you do not always get clean impressions. What we found were not clean impressions. They were disruptions in the ice surface, irregular and large, that extended from the shaft entrance toward the tree line to the north. I measured the spacing of the disruptions and found it ranged between 7 and 9 feet between each mark. And I told the search party these were likely animal tracks distorted by the ice conditions. I do not believe any of them fully accepted this explanation. I'm not certain I fully accepted it myself. We searched the tree line and found no further trace of either man. I filed a report with the company noting 2 workers as missing and presumed to have left the operation without notice. I wrote that report and I filed it, and I went back to my shift calculations. And weeks later, I understood that I had made a decision in that moment to keep the operation running rather than ask the questions that needed to be asked. And that decision cost every man in that camp something that cannot be returned to them. December came with weather of the kind that reshapes a man's understanding of what cold means. The temperature at Lacasse Creek in the first week of December dropped to points on the thermometer that the instrument had not been calibrated to record. The company medical officer, a physician named Arsenault, who had been brought up from Quebec City with considerable reluctance, recorded overnight temperatures he estimated at 50 degrees below the Fahrenheit standard, acknowledging in his notes that the thermometer had reached its lower limit, and he could not verify what lay beneath it. Men do not function well at those temperatures. You breathe carefully because the air will damage tissue in your lungs if you pull it in too quickly. Every exposed surface freezes within minutes. The simple act of walking from the bunkhouse to the cookhouse across a space of perhaps 40 yards requires full preparation and deliberate effort. Now, we maintained operations because we were expected to maintain operations and because the alternative was accepting a significant financial penalty in the contract. But the mood of the camp in early December was not the buoyant mood of a successful operation from 2 months earlier. Men were tired. Men were cold. Men were beginning to ask about the 2 missing workers in ways that suggested the explanation of voluntary departure was becoming less satisfying to them the more time passed. 2 more men disappeared on December 8th. They were timber workers whose job was to cut and process the support timbers used in shaft bracing. They had gone into the forest to the east of the camp with a 2-man cross-cut saw and a hand axe at approximately 7 in the morning and had not returned by midday. The search party I sent found their tools abandoned in the snow approximately 200 yards from the camp perimeter. The cross-cut saw was lying in the snow as if dropped rather than set down. The hand axe was embedded in the side of a felled spruce as if the man using it had simply walked away from a swing in the middle of a task. And around the abandoned tools, in the fresh snow that had fallen overnight and remained largely undisturbed under the spruce canopy, there were tracks. I examined these tracks myself. They were not distorted by ice or obscured by previous foot traffic. They were clear impressions in fresh, dry powder snow, and they were unlike anything I had seen in 14 years of working in northern Canadian wilderness. The stride length was between 8 and 10 feet, and each impression was roughly the shape of a human foot, but approximately twice the length and width of the largest human foot I could conceive of. There were 5 toe impressions in each print arranged in the pattern of a human foot, rather than the wider spread pattern of a bear or other large animal. The depth of each impression suggested a weight that I could not calculate with any confidence, but the impressions were significantly deeper than those left by any of the men in the search party. I looked at those tracks for a long time. Then I told the men with me that we were dealing with a large animal, possibly a bear of unusual size that the cold weather had brought down from higher altitude. I told them to return to camp and say nothing to alarm the others. Then I followed the tracks for approximately 50 yards into the trees alone, until the tracks turned northeast and the forest became dark enough between the spruce that I could see no more than 10 feet in any direction. I stopped following at that point, not because I had made a rational decision to stop, because something in my body refused to go further. I stood there in the cold and the dark of those trees, and something that I can only describe as an absolute animal certainty came over me that I was being watched. Not watched the way an animal watches, with the attention of a predator assessing a potential meal. Watched with intention, watched with patience, watched by something that was aware of my awareness of it and was content to let me understand that awareness. I walked back to camp very carefully. I called a meeting of the senior staff that evening. There were 6 of us. Myself, I'm the shift supervisor for the eastern shaft, the shift supervisor for the northern shaft, the company clerk, the medical officer, Arsenault, and the camp quartermaster. I told them what I had found around the abandoned timber tools. I told them about the tracks. I told them about the earlier disappearances and my decision to record them as voluntary departures. The shift supervisor for the northern shaft, a taciturn, experienced man named Brossard, who had been in mining operations for longer than any of us, listened to everything I said without expression, and then asked me one question. He asked if I had spoken to anyone about what the Algonquin guide had told Tremblay in October. I said I had not. Brossard said that Tremblay had told him. Then Brossard said he had spent 3 weeks trying to find a rational explanation for what Tremblay had described, and had found none that satisfied him. He said that in his 30 years of working remote northern operations, he had encountered many things that frightened men, and that almost all of them had turned out to be explicable by natural causes once properly investigated. He said he had a feeling about this situation that he did not have a natural explanation for. The medical officer said that we were grown men in a demanding environment under considerable psychological stress, and that reports of unusual tracks and uncanny sensations were consistent with the kinds of perceptual distortions that occurred in extreme cold and prolonged isolation. Brossard looked at him for a moment, and then said that if Arsenault wanted to stake his professional assessment on that position, he was welcome to do so, but that Brossard himself was going to recommend we request additional manpower and firearms from the company and implement overnight patrols of the camp perimeter. I approved the patrol recommendation. I sent a courier to Sainte Marguerite with a report requesting additional personnel and supplies, worded carefully enough to avoid triggering a formal investigation, but communicating the seriousness of our situation to anyone reading carefully. And I spent the rest of that night sitting in my office listening to the cold outside and thinking about the track depth and the stride length and the absolute certainty of being watched that I had felt standing 50 yards into those trees. Then the patrols began on December 11th. I assigned the most experienced men to the patrol rotations, men who knew cold weather operation, men who were steady under pressure. Each patrol consisted of 3 men armed with rifles, moving a circuit of the camp perimeter in 2-hour rotations throughout the night. The first 3 nights of patrol produced nothing reportable. The 4th night, December 14th, one of the patrol teams reported that they had heard a sound from the northern tree line at approximately 2 in the morning. I spoke to all 3 men on that patrol the following morning. They were not men who frightened easily, and they were not men who were given to dramatization. They agreed on the character of the sound. It was a long, sustained vocalization, unlike anything they recognized. It was not a wolf. They were all certain on that point. It was not any large mammal they could identify. It occupied a frequency range that they described variously as too deep, as resonant in the chest rather than just the ears, and as carrying a quality that one of them, a former military man named Laponte, who had served in the Northwest Territories campaign, described as deliberate. He used that word specifically. Not animal. Deliberate. As if the sound was being produced with intention rather than instinct. The sound lasted, by their estimate, between 30 and 45 seconds. Then it stopped. The forest was silent. Nothing moved at the tree line. The patrol continued its circuit without further incident. Similar sounds were reported on December 17th and December 19th. On December 19th, the patrol team also observed, and for a period they estimated at between 5 and 10 seconds, a shape at the northern tree line that was too large and too narrow to be a bear, and that appeared to be standing upright. I examined the ground at the northern tree line the following morning with Brossard and 2 other men. We found the same track pattern I'd observed in the timber cutting area. Fresh impressions in overnight snow. Stride length of 8 to 10 feet. Depth consistent with significant weight. The tracks ran parallel to the tree line for approximately 70 yards and then turned into the forest toward the north. Brossard looked at the tracks for a long time without speaking. Then he said that he thought we should begin sending men out in larger groups and that no one should be permitted to move between structures alone after dark. I agreed with him. The disappearances accelerated in the last week of December. 3 men vanished on December 22nd, 2 more on December 25th, and 4 on December 28th. None of them were found. No bodies. No additional equipment or personal effects discovered outside the perimeter. In each case, the men had last been observed within the camp or at the immediately adjacent work areas, and had simply ceased to be present at some point during the night or during the low-light hours of early morning and late afternoon when the darkness at that latitude in December is nearly continuous. The camp's population was decreasing visibly. You could see it in the bunkhouses. You could see it in the cookhouse at mealtimes, where tables that had been crowded and loud a month earlier were now half empty and quiet. Men were sleeping poorly. The men were losing weight in the accelerated way that happens when the body is operating under sustained stress and fear, rather than merely sustained cold. Arguments broke out over small things. 2 men had to be separated by force in the second week of December over a dispute about a bunk location that would not have escalated to violence under ordinary circumstances. I sent a second courier to Sainte Marguerite on December 29th with a communication that was considerably more direct than my first one. I described the situation accurately. I described the number of missing men. I described the tracks. I said that I did not have an explanation for what was happening and that I was requesting an immediate investigation and reinforcement. The courier reached Sainte Marguerite and delivered the message, but then the town's constable sent word back that he would organize a party and come to the settlement as quickly as conditions allowed. The conditions in late December in the Laurentian Highlands did not allow quickly. His party would not arrive until February. Christmas at the Lacasse Creek settlement in 1887 was not observed. There was no appetite for it. In January, the creature came closer. I use the word creature now without qualification. By January, I'd stopped attempting to construct alternative explanations. Whatever was moving around the perimeter of our camp, whatever had taken 26 of our men by the first week of January, was not a bear, was not a pack of wolves, was not a human animal, was not anything that had a name in the biological catalogues I had studied. I knew what I thought it was, and I'd known since Brossard showed me the Algonquin word for it in a reference text he had obtained from the Territorial Library Correspondence Service. I was not willing to say the word out loud in front of the men because I believed that attaching a specific supernatural identity to what we were dealing with would cause a collapse of morale that would cost lives more quickly than the threat itself. But I knew. The patrols in January began finding evidence of the creature's presence within the camp perimeter rather than at the tree line. On January 6th, the night patrol found tracks in the snow between the eastern bunkhouse and the cookhouse. The stride pattern, the same depth. Within the camp boundary, less than 30 yards from the structures where men were sleeping. On January 9th, the tracks were found at the rear wall of the northern shaft bunkhouse. On January 12th, the patrol found tracks that led directly to the door of the medical cabin, circled it twice, and led away toward the eastern tree line. Arsenault, when I showed him the tracks outside his cabin, was silent for a very long time. Then he asked me what I thought we should do. This was the first time since December that he had not offered a psychological or physiological explanation for what the men were reporting. I took his silence as an acknowledgement that he had updated his assessment. I told him I was going to begin organizing a phased withdrawal from the operation. I was going to send men out in groups toward Sainte Marguerite via the ice road, or rotating in batches large enough to be safer than individual travel, but small enough to allow the operation to continue in the short term. I was going to contact the company superintendent and explain that we were facing a situation requiring suspension of operations pending investigation. I was going to do all of these things over the course of the following week. I did not have a week. On the night of January 16th, the thing came into the camp. I was in my office, which was a separate structure at the center of the camp. It was after midnight. I'd been reviewing personnel records and attempting to compose a communication to the company's superintendent that accurately described the situation without triggering a response that would delay actual assistance. But the temperature outside was somewhere near the lower limit of Arsenault's thermometer. What I heard first was the horses. The stable was the nearest structure to my office, perhaps 20 yards to the south. The horses had been in a state of continuous low anxiety for weeks, but what I heard that night was qualitatively different from their usual restlessness. It was a sound that horses make when they are beyond the capacity for ordinary fear and have entered something that I can only describe as terror. I had heard horses in military situations, at the edges of battle conditions, making sounds in the registers of extreme distress. This was that register. Then the stable went quiet. Not a gradual quiet, an immediate one. I sat very still in my office for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I took my rifle from the rack on the wall and I checked that it was loaded, and I went to the window that faced the stable. The moon that night was in its first quarter, and the snow cover amplified what light there was, so that the camp was visible in a dim blue-gray illumination rather than complete darkness. I could see the stable door. I could see the space between the stable and the bunkhouses to the east. I could see the cookhouse to the north of my position. What I saw, standing between the stable and the eastern bunkhouse, was the following. A figure, standing upright on two legs, of a height that I will attempt to describe accurately at the risk of sounding like a man who has lost his rational faculties. The roof of the eastern bunkhouse was at a height of approximately 14 feet from the ground. The figure's head, and as it stood between the stable and the bunkhouse, was level with or slightly above the roofline of the bunkhouse. I have measured 14 feet on buildings throughout the rest of my life, and looked at that height and tried to verify my recollection against what I remember seeing. My recollection does not change. It was thin in a way that was deeply wrong. Not thin the way an animal is thin after a hard winter. Thin in a way that suggested the proportions of the figure were structured according to different principles than those that govern the bodies of animals or men. Its arms were too long. Its shoulders were too narrow for its height. Its head was angled slightly downward as it stood there, as if it were looking at something on the ground in front of it. And its posture carried a quality that I struggled to describe, except to say that it was patient, not paused, not waiting in the way a predator waits before a strike. Patient in a way that suggested an enormous and ancient indifference to the passage of time. It stood there for what I believe was between 2 and 4 minutes. During that time I did not move. I did not call out. I held my rifle, and I did not raise it because something in the architecture of what I was looking at communicated to me with complete clarity that a rifle was as meaningless in this situation as a pointed finger. I breathed. I watched. I stayed absolutely still. Then it turned its head toward my window. I cannot describe its face in detail because I do not believe I processed what I saw clearly in that moment. I can tell you that its eyes, which were visible in the reflected moonlight off the snow, were pale and luminous and very large. I can tell you that it saw me. I know it saw me because its posture changed in a way that I interpreted as acknowledgement. Not threat, not the gathering tension of an animal preparing to move toward prey. Acknowledgement, the way a man who has been watching you from across a room might shift slightly when you finally look back at him. And then it moved. It moved toward the northern tree line with a speed that I've never been able to reconcile with the unhurried patience of its previous posture. Not the explosive speed of a springing animal. Something else. Something that covered ground in a way that seemed to involve fewer movements than it should have, as if the space between points was being traversed through a different mechanism than ordinary locomotion. It was at the tree line, and then it was gone, and the entire episode from the moment I reached the window to the moment it disappeared occupied perhaps 10 minutes at the outside. I sat on the floor of my office with my rifle across my knees for the rest of the night. In the morning I told Brossard what I had seen. I did not tell the other men. Brossard listened without interruption. When I finished, he asked me one question, which was whether I believed the operation could be safely continued. I told him no. He told me he agreed, and that he had agreed since the 1st of January, and had been waiting for me to reach the same conclusion. I told him we needed to begin the evacuation immediately, in the largest groups we could organize. And that we needed to do it without causing a panic that would result in men leaving in disorganized individual departures into the dark. We spent January 17th organizing the first departure group. 40 men, the ones with the most experience in cold weather travel, equipped with as much provision and cold weather gear as they could carry, departing at first light for the ice road to Sainte Marguerite. 40 miles in January. Conditions at that latitude was a serious undertaking. I estimated 2 days of hard travel if the weather held. I did not go with that group. I stayed to organize the second and third groups. 31 men departed in the first group at dawn on January 18th. 12 of them reached Sainte Marguerite. The others were gone by the time the survivors arrived. The survivors could not describe what had happened with any coherence. They said that the group had stayed together for the first day. They said that on the second morning before first light, men began to disappear from the camp they had made on the ice road. They said they heard sounds from the surrounding forest that they recognized from the camp's patrol reports. They said the remaining men ran. They said some of the men who ran were simply no longer there between one moment and the next, as if the darkness between the trees had taken them. 12 men arrived in Sainte Marguerite. Their condition was described in the constable's records as severe. I did not learn this until February. In January, after the first group departed, I continued organizing the second group departure, not knowing yet that the first group had been devastated on the road. The camp, in the final weeks of January, was a different place from the camp I had managed in November. The population was below 80 men. The remaining men were operating in a state of managed fear that was sustainable only because the alternative to managed fear was unmanaged fear, which kills people in a cold environment in ways that can be predicted and timed. I maintained routines. I maintained mealtimes and work assignments and the pretense of normal operation because routine is a container for fear, and fear without a container is merely panic. But it was harder each day to maintain. Men were seeing things at the edges of the camp at night. Not always the full figure I had seen on January 16th. Shapes at the tree line, by the reflection of large pale eyes in lantern light. Movement between structures that resolved into nothing when approached. One man, a steady young miner named Coate, who was among the most reliable workers in the camp, told me in the third week of January that he had woken the previous night to find the window of the bunkhouse completely blocked, not darkened, but blocked, as if something large had moved to within inches of the exterior glass and was occupying the entire space of the window frame. He said the window had been clear when he next looked, perhaps 10 seconds later. He said he had not slept after that and did not intend to sleep again in that camp. I organized the second departure group on January 27th. 40 men again, similarly equipped. I told them to travel together, to maintain visual contact at all times, to make noise rather than silence, because silence in those conditions makes it harder to track the position of other members of the group. I watched them leave at dawn. Some of them looked back at the camp as they went. Some of them did not. By the first week of February, the camp's population was below 30 men. There were 28 of us, by my count, still at the Lacasse Creek settlement when I made my final roster count on the morning of February 6th. We had enough fuel and food for perhaps 3 weeks at reduced consumption. The ice road was increasingly compromised by the weather patterns of late January. On the night of February 8th, the thing came through the camp in a way that it had not come before. I was in the bunkhouse with 23 other men. It was approximately 3 in the morning. The bunkhouse was lit by 2 lanterns. Men were attempting to sleep with varying degrees of success. What I heard first from outside built in the way I had come to recognize over the preceding weeks. The deep carrying resonance that you felt more than heard, distant enough at first, then closer. Then the particular silence of the horses that meant the horses had stopped making any sound at all. Then something struck the exterior wall of the bunkhouse with a force that I've never seen any structure take and remain standing. Not a blow, a pressure, as if the entire wall had been shoved from the outside by something of enormous weight, operating with deliberate restraint. The wall flexed. 2 of the timber support joints cracked. The ceiling joists groaned in a way that pulled every man in that bunkhouse instantly awake and upright. And then it did it again. The other wall this time. The same pressure, the same controlled force. Not destroying the structure, testing it, moving around it. I have thought about this behavior many times in the years since. I believe now that it was not attempting to bring the structure down. I believe it was communicating something. What exactly it was communicating, I cannot say with certainty, But the quality of those impacts was not the quality of something trying to break through. It was the quality of something making its presence known in terms that could not be misunderstood. The men in the bunkhouse were silent. No one moved for what felt like a very long time. Then it was at the door. Not knocking, pressing. The door was a heavy timber door, braced from the inside with a wooden bar, and the pressure against it was steady and not violent, and the door held, but the bar bent slightly in its brackets. I watched it bend, and I thought with the cold clarity that extreme fear sometimes produces, that if it wanted to be through that door, it would already be through that door, and the fact that it was not through the door was itself a form of communication. Then the pressure stopped. We listened. We heard movement outside. We heard movement going away from the bunkhouse. We heard, from the direction of the cookhouse, sounds that I will not describe in detail. I will say only that they told us the 5 men who had been in the cookhouse that night were no longer able to be helped by anything we could do from inside the bunkhouse. We left the camp at first light on February 9th. 24 men. There's everything we could carry in terms of provisions and gear, moving as fast as we could move on to the ice road towards Sainte Marguerite. I did not look back at the camp as we left. I've always considered that a mercy I extended to myself. There are enough things in my memory from those months without adding the image of that camp in the early morning light behind us. The road to Sainte Marguerite was 40 miles in deteriorating winter conditions with 23 men in various states of physical and psychological compromise. We stayed together. We heard it in the forest behind us for the first 12 miles, the deep resonance moving parallel to the road at a distance that remained roughly constant, neither closing nor retreating, simply maintaining its position relative to ours. I did not understand this behavior at the time. And I've thought about it since, and I believe it was not pursuing us. I believe it was watching us leave. There is a difference between those two things, and I believe the difference was intentional. After the 12th mile, the sounds stopped, and we did not hear them again. We arrived in Sainte Marguerite, 18 men. The 6 men who were not there when we arrived had been there when we began. I did not see what happened to any of them. They were present, and then they were not. I do not have a more specific accounting to give. 18 of us arrived in Sainte Marguerite on February 11th, 1888. The constable, a man named Huot, who I have thought about often over the years as a genuinely decent official operating far beyond the resources available to him, took my statement over the course of 2 days. That he organized a party that entered the Lacasse Creek Valley in late February and confirmed what I had suspected they would find. The camp was empty. The structures were intact. Personal effects, wages, tools, and equipment were present and undisturbed. There were no bodies. There was no blood. There was no evidence of fire or flood or structural collapse or any industrial accident that might account for a camp losing its entire population. There was evidence in the snow around the camp of the track pattern I had described to him. He noted this in his report, and then noted in the same report that he was unable to identify the animal responsible. The official record of the Lacasse Creek incident attributes the disappearances to a combination of factors, including extreme weather conditions, inadequate supply planning, and improbable voluntary abandonment by workers in circumstances of severe environmental stress. I have read that official record. It is a document written by people who needed a rational explanation that would allow them to close a file. They closed the file. The valley is still there. I have been asked many times in the years since what I believe the Wendigo to be. I am not a religious man in the conventional sense, and I am not a man who reaches easily for supernatural explanation. But I have spent 33 years thinking carefully about what I saw and what I experienced at Lacasse Creek, and I have arrived at a position I can state plainly. I believe that the land in places like that valley holds things that are as real as anything else that holds territory and defends it and operates according to its own principles of necessity. And I believe that the Algonquin peoples of that region had observed those things over hundreds of generations and had developed knowledge about them that my culture dismissed as superstition because we had not been in that land long enough to learn what it contained. I believe that the mining company I worked for entered a territory claimed by something that had no reason to accommodate our presence and every capacity to refuse it. And I believe that the appetite we attributed to that territory, the silver, the economic value, the quarterly production targets, the bonuses for senior staff, was as nothing against the appetite of what we disturbed. We went into that valley to take what we wanted from it. We took nothing. Something was already there. It had been there before the first European surveyor set foot in that watershed. It will be there after the last one leaves. The land in the deep places does not remember us when we are gone, because the land does not need to remember things that were never capable of making a lasting impression on it. I walked out of that valley. I have never gone back.